My husband told his Tinder match that I was just a roommate. I should have known better than to hook up with a stranger at my friend's birthday party. But I did. And 6 weeks later, I found myself staring at a positive pregnancy test in my school's dilapidated bathroom. At first, I actually thought I was lucky. The father, Joffrey, stepped up instantly and married me at the courthouse 4 months later. We moved into his apartment thinking we were making all the right steps, taking responsibility. But it wasn't that simple. I quickly realized that Joffrey was actually a jerk. He played the perfect father-to-be, but only in public. He'd put his hand on my belly for photos, telling his parents stories about my crazy cravings like he listened. But in reality, he missed all the ultrasound appointments, always giving excuses. And when I sent him pics of the ultrasound, Joffrey just gave a thumbs up and joked, "Are we sure that's mine?" It felt lonely, and I was honestly scared of taking care of everything on my own. That's when his roommate John started secretly helping me out. He started stocking the kitchen with chocolates, fruits, and whatever craving I had. He had extra prenatal vitamins on the counter when mine started running low. And the thing is, he never said anything about it, just nodded when we passed in the kitchen. By the second trimester, John and I started becoming close friends. He'd go to all the parenting classes with me, help me shop for all the things I needed to care for the kid. And Joffrey? The only thing he bought so far was a pair of infant Jordans, saying, "My kid has to look fresh or it ain't mine." Then it happened. In the middle of the night, I felt the worst contractions just crushing my pelvis. I tried to reach out to Joffrey, called him 17 times while I crawled along the floor, crying out from the pain. But he never answered. John heard me and didn't hesitate. He drove me to the ER and stayed while they rushed me in. That's when things went wrong. I started bleeding and couldn't stop. The monitors were going crazy and nurses kept running in and out. John was frantically calling Joffrey over and over, his hands shaking. I reached out and grabbed John's hand and said, "John, I want you here. Not Joffrey. Please." He squeezed back and stayed right there even when they told him to wait outside. While I was in surgery, John called Joffrey's parents from the waiting room to explain what was happening. "Joffrey isn't picking up and she's already going into labor." "That stupid son of a..." "We'll call him, thank you," my father-in-law said, clearly furious as they spammed Joffrey's phone. 3 hours later, after the baby was born and I was stable, Joffrey finally stumbled into the hospital room. His shirt had lipstick stains on the collar and he reeked of perfume that wasn't mine. He saw John sitting next to my bed, holding my hand while I held our baby, and lost it. "What do you think you're doing with my wife?" he screamed, rushing over to grab John by the collar. John held him by the collar too and glared. "Taking care of her while you were busy on Tinder calling her your roommate." Joffrey immediately let him go, stumbling back, completely thrown off. "That's right. I saw the screenshots from a friend. You matched with her and said the baby was your pet and the woman in your apartment was just another roommate. And now you call her wife just because another guy is interested in doing the things you don't have the balls for?" John bit back. Joffrey's looked at me and laughed. "You gonna believe him over your husband? The husband who shows up to his child's birth drunk with another woman's lipstick on his shirt?" "Yeah, I think I will," I told him, holding the baby closer. His face changed then into something colder than ice. "Fine. Choose him. But if you do, you're not getting a penny from me. No child support, nothing. Good luck raising that kid on his pathetic salary." I looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't care. I choose John." Joffrey actually laughed. "Perfect. You two can be poor together. Have fun shopping at discount stores and clipping coupons. The kid's gonna grow up in some crappy apartment eating ramen because you wanted to play house with the help. The only person who's gonna be poor is you." We all turned and spotted his parents standing at the doorway, incredibly angry. "Mommy? Daddy?" Joffrey whimpered. And what his parents did next actually surprised me. Camilla walked right past Joffrey and stood between him and my bed, her hands shaking but her voice steady when she told him he'd lost the right to make any demands after missing his child's birth to be with another woman. Dylan stepped up beside her and added that they'd been covering for him too long and it stopped right now. Joffrey tried to argue, saying they didn't understand the pressure he was under, but his father cut him off mid-sentence and said they'd discuss consequences at home, and he needed to leave the hospital right away. Joffrey looked between his parents and me, his face going red, but Dylan pointed at the door and told him to go. I pressed the call button for the nurse, and when she came in, I asked her to have Joffrey removed from the room because I needed calm and safety for the baby. John stayed in the corner, quiet, but his presence felt solid, while Joffrey protested that he was the father and had rights. The nurse looked at me, then at Joffrey's disheveled appearance and the lipstick still visible on his collar, and told him he needed to leave so the new mother could rest. She gestured toward the door and stood there waiting until he finally stumbled out, muttering under his breath. The door clicked shut, and I let out this huge breath I didn't know I was holding, pulling my daughter closer and feeling her tiny warmth against my chest. John asked if I was okay, and I nodded, too tired to say anything else. Camilla touched my arm gently and said they'd come back tomorrow when things were calmer, and Dylan squeezed John's shoulder on their way out, thanking him for being there. The next morning, I woke up to a soft knock and found Camilla standing there with a huge canvas bag, looking nervous. She came in and immediately started apologizing, saying they had no idea how bad things had gotten and that they should have paid closer attention. She pulled out diapers, wipes, receiving blankets, all practical stuff I actually needed, and set them on the chair beside my bed. She asked what I needed, not what Joffrey wanted, and the difference in those words made my throat tight. Dylan appeared a few minutes later and offered to drive me home from the hospital when I got discharged, adding that they wanted to be involved grandparents even if their son wasn't acting like a father. I thanked them and meant it, surprised by how much their support meant when I'd expected them to defend Joffrey no matter what. A woman in a cardigan knocked and introduced herself as Brooklyn Zamora, the hospital social worker doing a standard postpartum check. She sat down and started asking routine questions about my support system and living situation, and somehow I ended up telling her everything. She listened without judgment, just nodding and taking notes, then pulled out pamphlets about legal aid, emergency help programs, and family court stuff. She explained that I had more options than I probably thought, and scheduled a follow-up appointment before discharge, writing her direct number on the back of her card. Having someone official acknowledge that my situation was complicated, but manageable made me feel less alone. Discharge day arrived faster than I expected, and John handled everything without me having to ask. He got the car seat installation checked by the nurse, picked up my prescriptions from the pharmacy, and loaded my bags while I fed the baby one more time. Dylan showed up exactly when he said he would, and helped carry things down to John's car, mentioning casually that Joffrey was staying with them for now, and wouldn't be at the apartment. Relief washed over me knowing I wouldn't have to face him the second I walked through the door. The drive home felt weird, like I was bringing this fragile person into a world that suddenly seemed too loud and dangerous. John carried the car seat up the stairs while Dylan grabbed the bags and they got everything inside before Dylan hugged me carefully and left. The first night back at the apartment felt completely surreal. This tiny person depended on me for literally everything, and I kept checking to make sure she was still breathing. John sat up on the couch with a blanket and pillow, saying he'd be right there if I needed help during the night. My phone kept lighting up with texts from Joffrey that swung wildly between begging and blaming. I turned off notifications and focused on figuring out how to change a diaper with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. At 3 a.m., I was crying because the baby wouldn't stop crying, and I couldn't tell if I was doing anything right. John appeared in the doorway and asked quietly if he could try burping her. He walked her around the living room humming some random song I didn't recognize until she finally settled and let out a huge burp. He didn't make me feel stupid or incompetent, just handed her back when she was calm, and told me I was doing great before heading back to the couch. By the end of the first week, I was making lists on everything I could find. Pediatrician appointment scheduled for Thursday, formula budget calculated down to the penny, laundry routine mapped out by day. John and I worked out a system where he handled grocery runs, and I managed all the medical appointments and baby supplies. The structure helped me feel less like I was drowning even though money was way tighter than I'd expected, and I was constantly doing math in my head. Camilla called midweek and asked if she and Dylan could visit to talk about how they could help without overstepping. I was cautious but agreed to meet at a coffee shop near campus where I felt more in control of the situation. They showed up with an actual written list of things they were offering: weekly grocery delivery, scheduled babysitting on specific days, help with certain bills. And they made it super clear that none of this was tied to me forgiving Joffrey or getting back together with him. Late one night, while the baby finally slept in her bassinet, I pulled up legal websites and started reading about child support calculations, custody arrangements, and how to establish paternity officially. The information was overwhelming and full of legal words I had to Google, but I took notes anyway, highlighting sections about temporary orders and what paperwork I'd need to gather. John noticed the laptop glow from the couch and brought me tea without asking what I was researching, just set it down beside me and went back to his spot. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of eggs cooking and found John at the stove making breakfast. He set a plate in front of me without asking and poured coffee, then sat down across the table looking uncomfortable. He picked at his food for a minute before finally speaking up about feeling caught between doing the right thing and betraying his roommate. Joffrey had been his friend first, he explained, back when they met at work and needed someone to split rent with. But watching him skip ultrasound appointments and joke about whether the baby was even his made John realize that friendship had limits. I told him straight up that he didn't owe Joffrey loyalty just because they signed a lease together, especially not when Joffrey was actively being a terrible husband and father. John nodded and seemed relieved to hear me say it out loud. After breakfast, I cleared the dishes and realized we needed to have another conversation before things got messier. I asked John to sit back down because we had to talk about boundaries. I explained that I was incredibly grateful for everything he'd done, from stocking prenatal vitamins to driving me to the hospital, but we couldn't let this turn romantic right now. He actually looked relieved instead of disappointed and agreed immediately, saying he wanted to help because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything from me. We shook hands like we were signing a business contract and both started laughing at how awkward we were being about the whole thing. The baby started fussing from her bassinet, so I picked her up and John grabbed the diaper bag, saying we should probably head to the pediatrician appointment soon. The clinic waiting room was packed with other parents and screaming kids, but Haley called us back within 20 minutes. She weighed the baby on the scale, checked her length and head size, then asked detailed questions about feeding patterns and diaper output. I'd been worried about the weight loss since birth, but Haley reassured me that losing a few ounces in the first week was completely normal, and the baby was already starting to gain it back. She scheduled a follow-up appointment for 2 weeks out and wrote her nurse's direct line on the back of an appointment card in case I had questions before then. Walking out of the clinic with that card in my hand felt like a small victory, like I was actually managing to keep my daughter healthy despite everything else falling apart. John drove us home and helped carry the diaper bag upstairs while I held the baby. Back at the apartment, we sat down for another practical conversation, this time about household management. John suggested we split chores down the middle and establish quiet hours when the baby usually slept. I added that we should set a policy about visitors, so Joffrey or anyone else couldn't just show up unannounced. He grabbed a marker and started writing a schedule on a piece of paper, listing who would handle grocery shopping, laundry, dishes, and trash. I took the marker and added a shared grocery list section at the bottom. We taped the whole thing to the fridge with magnets and stepped back to look at it. The setup felt weird, being this domestic with someone who wasn't my husband, but it was already working better than my actual marriage ever had. Tuesday afternoon, I was finally getting the baby down for a nap when someone started pounding on the apartment door. The noise woke her up immediately and she started screaming. I yanked the door open with her crying in my arms and found Joffrey standing there looking annoyed. I told him firmly that he needed to coordinate visits through his parents instead of just showing up whenever he felt like it. He argued that it was his apartment too and he had every right to be there. I reminded him that he'd been staying with Camilla and Dylan for over a week, and that if he wanted any relationship with his daughter, he needed to respect boundaries. He tried to push past me into the apartment, but I blocked the doorway and told him to leave or I'd call his parents. He finally backed off and walked away, muttering something I couldn't hear. I closed the door and locked it, then spent 20 minutes trying to calm the baby down from her screaming fit. Brooklyn called the next day, asking if I could come to her office to discuss next steps. I packed up the baby and took the bus across town to the community services building. Brooklyn's office was tiny and cluttered with files, but she had a whole folder ready with my name on it. She pulled out referral forms for legal aid and started explaining the custody paperwork process. Then she handed me information about WIC and child care assistance programs, circling the phone numbers I needed to call. The most important thing she did was help me draft a safety plan in case Joffrey showed up aggressive or drunk. We wrote down specific steps like locking doors, calling his parents first, then calling police if needed. She made copies of everything and put one set in my folder and gave me the other set to keep at home. Having someone in my corner who actually knew how the system worked made everything feel less impossible to handle. That evening, John spread a bunch of printouts across the kitchen table and explained he'd been researching lease options. He was worried because having his name tied to Joffrey's on the lease could become a real problem if things got worse. He showed me information about lease transfers and subletting rules, already thinking ahead about worst-case situations. The printouts had highlighted sections about breaking leases early and what fees we might have to pay. I was grateful he was being this proactive, even though it meant we might have to move or pay more rent somewhere else. We talked through different scenarios for over an hour, trying to figure out what made the most sense financially. Friday morning, my phone rang and Camilla's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but figured I should hear what she had to say. She started talking fast, explaining that she'd seen Joffrey's Tinder profile where he listed me as just a roommate and called the baby his pet. Her voice was shaking, she was so angry. She said they knew their son was immature but didn't realize he was actively lying about having a family to pick up other women. She apologized for not seeing how bad things really were and asked if they could do a supervised visit at their house that weekend. She emphasized that she and Dylan wanted to know their grandchild, even if Joffrey was acting like a complete stranger to his own daughter. I agreed to bring the baby over Saturday afternoon as long as Joffrey wouldn't be there. I pulled up my school email and started typing a message to my academic advisor explaining that I'd had the baby and needed to discuss leave options. I kept it short and factual, just the basics about needing time off and wanting to know about coming back eventually. She responded within 3 hours with forms for medical leave attached and information about keeping my financial aid active during the absence. She wrote that I could come back part-time whenever I was ready, and that the school had resources for student parents. The flexibility was a huge relief, even though I was worried about falling behind in my program and having to take longer to graduate. Monday morning, I walked into the legal aid office for my appointment with Amelia Lindsay, carrying a folder stuffed with every document I could find. She was younger than I expected and had her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She sat me down and started explaining how child support actually worked, using a calculator to show me the formula based on income and custody time. Then she moved on to custody arrangements and how we'd need court orders for everything to be official. The part that surprised me was learning we'd need a paternity test, even though Joffrey's name was already on the birth certificate. She said it was standard procedure and would protect both of us legally. She outlined a timeline of several weeks minimum for everything to process, and warned me that once paternity was established, Joffrey could request visitation rights through the court. I left with homework, a list of financial documents to gather, instructions to write a detailed timeline of his involvement, and information about preparing for mediation. The legal process felt overwhelming, but at least now I had a roadmap instead of just guessing what to do next. Camilla walked straight up to Joffrey and slapped him hard across the face. The sound echoed in the quiet hospital room, and Joffrey stumbled backward, holding his cheek. Dylan stepped forward and grabbed his son by the shoulder, spinning him around to face the door. He told Joffrey to get out and not come back until he could act like an adult who takes responsibility for his actions. Joffrey tried to argue, but Camilla cut him off, saying they were done making excuses for him and watching him destroy his own family. They marched him out of the room while he protested weakly, and I heard their voices fading down the hallway. John and I sat there in shocked silence for a minute, just processing what had happened. Then Camilla came back alone, her face red but her voice steady. She apologized for not seeing how bad things were, and said they wanted to support me and the baby regardless of what Joffrey chose to do. Dylan returned a few minutes later carrying a bag from the hospital gift shop with diapers and a stuffed animal. They stayed for 20 minutes asking practical questions about what I needed when I got home, writing down a list, promising to check in regularly. When they left, John squeezed my hand and said he didn't expect that either. 3 days after we got home from the hospital, John came back from checking the mail looking worried. He handed me an official letter from the property management company with both his and Joffrey's names on it. I read through the dense paragraphs about lease obligations and saw the problem immediately. Any changes to the lease required both tenants to sign, or we needed a court order showing domestic issues or financial hardship. John sat down at the kitchen table and ran his hands through his hair, explaining that if Joffrey decided to be difficult out of spite, John could end up stuck paying for someone who didn't even live here anymore. I felt guilty that helping me was creating this mess for him. We spent the next hour going through options, talking about maybe finding a cheaper place somewhere else, or asking Tyler Wood, the landlord, if there were any emergency transfer options. John made notes on his phone about what documentation we might need and said he'd call Tyler in the morning to discuss it. The baby started crying from her bassinet, and I went to pick her up, feeling the weight of how complicated everything was becoming. A week later, I was coming back from the corner store with formula when I spotted Joffrey waiting near the apartment building entrance. My stomach dropped, but I kept walking, planning to go past him without stopping. He stepped into my path and held up his hands like he was surrendering. He said his parents were on his case constantly, and he wanted to make things easier for both of us. Then he pulled out his wallet and showed me a stack of cash, offering it if I'd agree to stop seeing John and give him another chance. I told him no and tried to walk around him, but he kept talking. He admitted the job he claimed to have the night of the birth didn't actually exist. He'd been at a bar lying to some woman he met online about being single. I felt anger rising in my chest but kept my face blank. I told him to move, and he finally stepped aside, muttering that I was making a mistake. The second I got inside the apartment, I opened my phone notes and typed out everything he said with exact quotes and the date and time. My hands were shaking while I typed, but I knew I needed to document it all. 2 weeks after the birth, I took the baby to her follow-up appointment with Haley. The pediatrician weighed her and checked her over, then frowned slightly while looking at her skin. She said there was mild jaundice that needed monitoring. My heart started racing, but Haley was calm, explaining it wasn't unusual and usually cleared up on its own. She wanted to see the baby again in a few days and gave me instructions about putting her near windows for indirect sunlight and watching for symptoms like extreme sleepiness or poor feeding. She handed me a printed sheet with warning signs and her nurse's direct phone number. I nodded and tried to act like I wasn't panicking inside. That evening after the baby fell asleep, I opened my laptop and started Googling jaundice in newborns. I went down a rabbit hole of medical websites and forums, reading about bilirubin levels and phototherapy and liver function. John came home from work and found me staring at the screen with tears running down my face. He gently closed the laptop and reminded me that Haley said it was manageable and we had a follow-up scheduled. I took a shaky breath and nodded, trying to believe him. John called Tyler the next morning and put him on speaker so I could hear. Tyler explained that splitting the lease wasn't as simple as we hoped. He needed either both tenants to consent and sign new paperwork, or a court document proving domestic issues or financial hardship. Since Joffrey wasn't officially living at the apartment anymore but wouldn't sign off on any changes, we were stuck in this weird limbo. Tyler sounded sympathetic and said he understood the situation was complicated, but he was bound by property management company rules and couldn't just remove someone from a lease without proper documentation. John asked about emergency transfers, and Tyler said those usually required proof of safety concerns or lease violations. We thanked him and hung up feeling frustrated. John slumped in his chair and said we might have to wait until the custody case was further along to get the court documents Tyler mentioned. I hated feeling trapped by paperwork and legal processes, but there wasn't much we could do except wait. By the end of that week, my phone was constantly lighting up with messages from people I barely knew. Word had spread among mutual friends about what happened at the hospital, and everyone suddenly had opinions or questions. Some messages were supportive, offering help or congratulations. Others were nosy, asking for details about the drama or wanting to know if John and I were together now. I felt overwhelmed by all the attention and decided I needed to control the story before rumors got worse. I opened my social media and typed out a short statement. Baby and I are healthy, handling things privately, appreciate space. I read it 3 times, making sure it didn't give away too much, then hit post. The messages slowed down after that, though I still got occasional intrusive questions from people I ignored. It helped to have something official out there so I didn't have to explain the same thing to everyone individually. John came home from work that Tuesday looking exhausted. He dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to the couch, not even taking off his shoes. I asked what was wrong, and he explained his manager had called him in for a meeting. Missing work the night of the emergency had affected his attendance record. He wasn't getting fired, but he got a formal warning and had to pick up extra shifts over the next month to make up for it. I felt terrible knowing that helping me was causing him problems at work. I told him I was sorry, and he shook his head, insisting he'd make the same choice again without hesitation. He said his job would stabilize once he worked the extra hours and not to worry about it. But I could see how tired he was, and knew those extra shifts would make everything harder for him. 3 days later, I got an email from Amelia with the subject line, mediation preparation. She'd scheduled our first session with a family court mediator for 2 weeks out. Attached were multiple documents including financial disclosure forms, proposed parenting time schedules, and detailed questions about the baby's daily routine. I printed everything out and spread the papers across the kitchen table. The forms asked for information about income, expenses, childcare costs, and housing situations. The parenting schedule template had sections for weekday visits, weekend arrangements, holidays, and decision-making authority. I spent the next 3 hours filling everything out as accurately as I could, checking bank statements and receipts to get exact numbers. My hand cramped from writing, but I knew these documents would shape the custody arrangements. Having concrete steps to follow made the legal process feel less scary and more like something I could actually handle. Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang, and I found Camilla and Dylan standing there with multiple grocery bags. Camilla explained they didn't want to just give us cash because they were worried Joffrey might try to claim it or cause problems. Instead, they brought actual groceries and supplies. They came in and started unpacking, filling the fridge with fresh food, stocking the pantry with basics, adding diapers and wipes to our supply. Dylan asked to hold the baby and sat on the couch making faces at her while Camilla organized the kitchen. They stayed for about an hour, playing with the baby and giving me a real break where I could just sit down. When they left, Camilla hugged me and said to text if we needed anything specific. Their approach felt respectful, not like charity or like they were trying to control things. I started trusting that their support wasn't about protecting Joffrey's image, but genuinely about helping their grandchild. 2 weeks after that, there was a knock on the apartment door late in the evening. I checked the peephole and saw Joffrey standing there looking tired. Against my better judgment, I opened the door but stayed in the doorway blocking his entry. He started out apologetic, saying he'd been thinking a lot and wanted to work things out. I told him we were handling everything through lawyers and mediators now. His expression changed and his voice got harder. He said if I insisted on dragging courts and lawyers into this, he'd fight for custody just to prove he could. He claimed he had rights as the father and could make my life difficult if he wanted to. I stayed calm and didn't react to the threats, just told him he needed to leave. After he left, I immediately pulled out my phone and texted Amelia about what happened, including the exact words he used. She responded within minutes saying that these kinds of threatening statements actually helped my case, and to keep documenting everything. At my 6-week postpartum checkup, the doctor did the usual physical exam, then handed me a questionnaire about my mood. The questions asked about feeling sad, anxious, overwhelmed, or having trouble sleeping beyond normal new parent exhaustion. I answered honestly, and my scores flagged low for depression and anxiety. The doctor sat down and talked to me about postpartum mental health, emphasizing it was just as important as physical recovery. She scheduled me with a counselor at the community health center and gave me an appointment card for the following week. I left the office with mixed feelings, relieved that someone had noticed I was struggling, but also worried about adding another thing to manage. The appointment card sat in my wallet, reminding me that taking care of myself mattered too, even when everything felt like it was about taking care of everyone else. That evening back at the apartment, John knocked on my bedroom door while the baby slept in her bassinet. He asked if we could talk, and I followed him to the kitchen where he'd made tea, the kind I actually liked without asking what flavor. He sat across from me at the small table and started talking about his own dad, who promised to show up to the school events and baseball games but never did. John described waiting in the parking lot after practice, watching other kids leave with their fathers while he sat alone until his mom finished her shift. He explained that watching Joffrey skip appointments and make jokes about the baby brought back that same feeling of wondering why he wasn't worth showing up for. John said he stepped up because he remembered being that kid and didn't want my daughter to grow up with that confusion. His hands wrapped around his mug, and he looked tired but honest, not trying to make himself sound like a hero. I told him I understood better now and thanked him for being real with me. The conversation felt important but not romantic, just two people being honest about hard stuff. 3 days later, I met with my academic advisor on campus, bringing the baby in her carrier because I couldn't find childcare. The advisor pulled up my file and confirmed the school approved my request for medical leave this semester without losing financial aid eligibility. She walked me through the conditions, pointing at her computer screen showing I needed to maintain continuous enrollment status and return to at least 6 credits next semester to keep my aid package. She handed me printed forms showing the grade requirements and enrollment timeline, explaining I could take classes part-time if full-time felt too hard. Having an actual path back to finishing my degree made everything feel less like my education was permanently over. I left her office with the paperwork in my bag and the baby still sleeping, feeling like maybe I could actually do both things even if it would be hard. The first mediation session happened in a plain office building downtown, where Quentin Barker, the mediator, had us sit at opposite ends of a conference table. Joffrey showed up 15 minutes late wearing sunglasses indoors and immediately started complaining that this whole thing was unnecessary. Quentin stayed completely neutral, explaining the process and asking basic questions about the baby's care and Joffrey's involvement. When Quentin mentioned establishing paternity, Joffrey actually laughed and said he wanted a DNA test because he wasn't sure the baby was his, despite being at the hospital. I felt my jaw clench but stayed quiet while Quentin calmly explained that paternity testing was standard procedure and we'd schedule it through the court-approved facility. Joffrey kept making comments about how I was trying to trap him and that John was probably the real father. Obvious stalling tactics that weren't working on Quentin. I focused on answering Quentin's questions directly and providing the documentation Amelia had helped me prepare. By the end of the hour, we had a court date for the DNA test and nothing else resolved, but at least the process was moving forward instead of stuck on Joffrey's denials. Brooklyn called me the next morning to coordinate the paternity test appointment, explaining she'd contacted a court-approved lab that did these tests regularly. She walked me through the timeline, saying samples would be collected from all three of us. Results would take 10 business days, and then we'd go back to mediation with actual proof. She also helped me write out interim visitation rules suggesting supervised visits at Camilla and Dylan's house if Joffrey wanted contact before results came back. We drafted language about notice requirements and appropriate behavior standards, creating boundaries that felt enforceable. Having these procedures spelled out made me feel less worried about Joffrey showing up drunk or aggressive, because there were actual rules now instead of just chaos. That same afternoon, my phone rang with Tyler, the landlord's number. He sounded frustrated and asked if I could explain what was happening because Joffrey had called him trying to get John evicted. Tyler said Joffrey claimed John was an unauthorized occupant causing problems and demanded Tyler remove him from the apartment. I explained the whole situation honestly, how Joffrey moved out to his parents' house, how John had been on the lease the entire time, and how Joffrey was trying to use the lease as another way to control things. Tyler sighed and confirmed that John was a legal tenant, and Joffrey couldn't force him out without legitimate cause like property damage or lease violations. He warned me that the drama was getting old, but reassured me that John's housing was secure as long as he paid rent and followed the rules. 2 days later, Tyler called again with a different tone, suggesting a possible solution to the lease mess. He explained that if Camilla and Dylan would co-sign paperwork releasing Joffrey from the lease, then John and I could potentially transfer to a smaller 2-bedroom unit in the same building that rented for slightly less. Tyler admitted the unit was smaller, probably 800 square feet instead of our current 1,000, and the kitchen was older, but it would legally separate us from Joffrey and solve the housing problem. I told him we were definitely interested, and he said he'd email the paperwork for us to review with the exact costs and timeline. The idea of less space felt tight, but the thought of Joffrey having no legal claim to where we lived was worth it. Late on Thursday night, I woke up to the baby screaming differently than usual, her cries sharper and more distressed. I picked her up and felt her skin burning hot against my chest, way hotter than normal. I grabbed my phone and called the pediatric nurse line, my hands shaking while I waited on hold. The nurse asked her temperature and symptoms, then told me firmly to go to urgent care immediately because fevers in infants under 3 months could be serious. I yelled for John, who came running in his boxers and t-shirt, already grabbing his keys when I said we needed to go now. He threw on jeans and shoes while I wrapped the baby in a blanket, my brain stuck on worst-case scenarios. John drove his beat-up car with the rattling muffler while I sat in back holding her, trying not to completely lose it. He stayed calm, talking me through breathing while he navigated to the urgent care clinic and handled finding parking while I rushed inside with her. The whole drive felt like forever, even though it was only 12 minutes. Inside the urgent care waiting room, I filled out forms with shaking hands while a nurse took the baby's temperature and vitals. John texted Camilla and Dylan without asking me first, just sent them the address and a quick update. 20 minutes later, they walked through the doors carrying a carrier with coffee and bottled water, not trying to take over but just sitting with us. Camilla held the baby while I finished paperwork, making soft cooing sounds and checking her temperature with the back of her hand like grandmothers do. Dylan sat next to John, comparing notes about the fastest route to the clinic and talking about nothing important, just filling the anxious silence. When the doctor finally called us back and said the fever was minor and treatable with medicine, I felt my whole body relax. Camilla and Dylan stayed until we got discharged, not making me feel stupid for the scare, just being present without drama or conditions. The paternity test appointment happened at a clinical lab in a medical building near the courthouse. A technician in scrubs explained the process while setting up supplies, saying she'd collect cheek swabs from Joffrey, me, and the baby, all documented and witnessed according to court requirements. Joffrey showed up exactly on time for once, staying quiet while the technician swabbed the inside of his cheek and sealed the sample in a labeled tube. She swabbed my cheek next, then gently swabbed the baby's mouth while she fussed and squirmed. The technician logged everything in her computer and printed receipts showing the samples were collected, explaining results would take 10 business days and get sent directly to the court and our attorneys. The waiting period ahead felt endless, knowing we were stuck in limbo until the results came back with proof everyone already knew. The school sent an email confirming my leave status was official, but included a notice that my financial aid stipend for living expenses wouldn't continue during medical leave. I stared at my bank account, realizing I'd lost $300 a month I'd been counting on for bills and baby supplies. I called Amelia, who walked me through applying for emergency assistance and food stamps, programs I'd never imagined needing. She helped me fill out the online applications, asking questions about income and expenses and household size that made me feel exposed. The safety net programs existed exactly for situations like mine, single mothers with no income trying to take care of kids, but accepting help felt like admitting I couldn't handle things alone. Amelia stayed on the phone while I submitted everything, reminding me that using available resources was smart, not shameful, even though my face burned with embarrassment the whole time. John came home the next evening looking different, like he'd made some big decision while I was sleeping. He sat down at the kitchen table where I was feeding the baby and told me he talked to his manager about switching to overnight warehouse shifts. The pay was slightly better, he explained, and it meant he'd be home during the day when I might need backup with the baby. I asked if he was sure because those shifts were harder physically, loading and unloading trucks for 8 hours straight. He just shrugged and said it made sense with our schedule, the baby sleeping more at night now, and we needed the extra money anyway. Over the next week, I watched him leave for work at 10 p.m. and come back at 7 a.m., his shirt soaked with sweat and his hands covered in small cuts from boxes. He'd shower, sleep until 2, then be up helping me with diaper changes and bottle prep like he hadn't just worked all night. The tiredness showed in his face, dark circles under his eyes and the way he'd zone out sometimes mid-conversation, but he never complained or acted like he was doing me some huge favor. My phone lit up one afternoon with notifications from 3 different people sending me screenshots. Joffrey had posted on social media with vague accusations about being kept from his child by a manipulative ex and her new boyfriend. The posts didn't name me directly, but anyone who knew us would figure it out immediately. He wrote about how some women use babies as weapons and how real fathers get pushed aside by guys trying to play hero. I felt my face get hot reading it, wanting to comment and defend myself, but instead I screenshot everything. I sent all of it to Amelia with a message asking if I should respond. She called me back within an hour and told me absolutely not to engage publicly. She explained that this kind of documentation actually helped establish his pattern of behavior, showing he was more interested in looking like a victim than actually being present. Engaging would just make things messier and give him ammunition to claim I was harassing him. I saved all the screenshots in a folder on my phone labeled Evidence and turned off social media notifications so I wouldn't see if he posted more. Amelia called a few days later saying she'd filed paperwork for temporary child support and a structured visitation plan. She explained it was based on the assumption that paternity would be confirmed, getting ahead of the process so we weren't scrambling later. The court date got set for 3 weeks out, which felt both too soon and impossibly far away. She walked me through what to expect, her voice matter-of-fact but not cold. The judge would likely grant Joffrey some visitation rights once paternity was proven, she said, and the most I could reasonably request was supervised visits at his parents' house. I asked what happened if he didn't show up or showed up drunk again. She said we'd document everything and use it to argue for stricter conditions, but the court generally wanted to give fathers chances to be involved unless there was clear danger. I hung up feeling like I understood the system better, but also trapped by how slowly it all moved. John suggested we needed to formalize our living arrangement, so nobody could claim we were doing something inappropriate or unclear. We sat down at the kitchen table one evening after the baby was asleep and wrote out actual rules on notebook paper. We're co-parenting housemates, not partners, I wrote at the top. John added that expenses get tracked and split fairly based on income. I included that there's no romantic relationship timeline or pressure from either person. He wrote that either of us can request renegotiation if things aren't working. We both read it over, made a few changes, then signed it like some weird contract. It felt awkward putting our relationship in writing like a business deal, but also clarifying. We knew exactly what we were doing and what we weren't. No assumptions or misunderstandings that could blow up later. Camilla called and invited me to dinner at their house, specifying that Joffrey wouldn't be there. She said they wanted to discuss boundaries and support on neutral ground, which sounded formal, but also respectful. I drove over on a Thursday evening with the baby, nervous about what they might say. Dylan opened the door and led me to their dining room where Camilla had set out homemade food, nothing fancy but clearly effort. Over dinner, they explained they were setting limits with their son. He couldn't manipulate them with guilt anymore, they said. They wouldn't fund his avoidance or make excuses for his behavior. Their relationship with their grandchild wasn't contingent on how Joffrey acted. Then Camilla asked what help would actually be useful rather than just assuming what I needed. I told them about childcare costs and the gaps in my budget from losing student aid. Dylan said they could cover a weekly grocery delivery, and Camilla offered to babysit one afternoon a week, so I could study or rest. Driving home, I felt lighter, like I had actual allies instead of just people connected to me through Joffrey. The second mediation session happened after Camilla confirmed Joffrey had been sober for a full week. I walked into Quentin's office expecting another fight, but Joffrey looked different, calmer and less defensive. Quentin started by asking if we could agree on supervised visitation as a starting point. Joffrey agreed immediately, saying he understood why I didn't trust him and that his parents' house made sense. Then he admitted something that surprised me, that he'd felt replaced by John and it triggered his worst behavior. Quentin worked through the details while we both stayed mostly quiet. 2 visits per week, 2 hours each, at Camilla and Dylan's house, until the court hearing. Joffrey would call ahead to confirm, and his parents would supervise the entire time. It wasn't perfect, and I still didn't fully trust him, but it was structured and safe. We signed the agreement Quentin typed up, and I left feeling like maybe we could handle this without everything exploding. The paternity results arrived in a plain envelope from the lab, sent to both attorneys and the court. Amelia called me before I even opened mine to confirm what everyone already knew. Joffrey was biologically the father, she said, which meant he had legal standing for custody discussions. The court would consider his request for visitation, and eventually we'd need a permanent custody arrangement. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest, knowing I'd be connected to him for at least 18 years, probably longer. But Amelia also said this moved us forward, that we could finally stop dealing with his denial games and start building formal arrangements. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the envelope on my kitchen counter before finally opening it to see the official confirmation in black and white. 2 weeks later, the court issued a temporary order garnishing Joffrey's wages for child support once he got employed. Amelia explained it started at the state minimum calculation based on 1 child and his earning potential. The order existed on paper now, legally binding, but she warned it would take weeks to see actual money. Joffrey needed to find a job first, then payroll processing took time to implement the garnishment. I asked how long before I'd see anything, and she said realistically a month or more, maybe longer if he dragged his feet on employment. The order didn't solve my immediate budget problems, which frustrated me, but at least it was official. If he ever did work, the money would come automatically without me having to chase him down. The first supervised visit at Camilla and Dylan's house was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. I dressed the baby in a clean outfit and drove over, my stomach tight with anxiety about how it would go. Camilla opened the door looking worried, then told me Joffrey had just arrived and something was wrong. I walked in and smelled it immediately. That sour alcohol smell mixed with too much cologne trying to cover it up. Joffrey was in the living room slurring his words, trying to say he just had 1 drink to calm his nerves. Camilla stepped between him and the baby, her voice firm, saying he wasn't holding her like this. Dylan was already on the phone, I assumed calling Joffrey, but then I realized he was calling me even though I was standing right there. Camilla canceled the visit on the spot and asked Dylan to drive Joffrey home. I left with the baby, disappointed but not surprised, and texted Amelia about what happened the moment I got to my car. Amelia called back within an hour after I sent her the details about the failed visit. She said this actually strengthened our case for continued supervision, and possibly requiring substance abuse evaluation. She walked me through the criteria for a protective order if his behavior escalated to threats or harassment, explaining what counted as credible threats versus just angry words. Having the options outlined made me feel less trapped by his unpredictability, like I had tools to use if things got worse. She told me to document every incident, every missed visit, every concerning behavior, because it all built the case for stricter custody conditions. I wrote everything down in my phone notes while it was fresh, including the time, what he said, what he smelled like, and how his parents responded. It felt clinical turning my life into evidence, but also necessary for protecting my daughter from his chaos. Tyler called 3 days later saying he found a solution if Camilla and Dylan would co-sign paperwork releasing Joffrey from the lease. He explained that a smaller 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor just opened up, and the rent was $60 less per month. The apartment was tighter, maybe 800 square feet total, but getting Joffrey's name off any legal documents tied to where I lived felt worth the cramped space. I asked Tyler to send over the forms, and he emailed them within the hour, along with instructions about what signatures he needed and when we could move. John and I sat at the kitchen table that night reviewing the paperwork while the baby slept in her bassinet next to us. The new place had 1 bathroom instead of 2, and the kitchen was smaller, but it meant legal separation from Joffrey, and that mattered more than square footage. I texted Camilla asking if she and Dylan would be willing to co-sign, and she responded yes within minutes, saying they'd come by the next day to handle it. When they showed up the following afternoon, Dylan read through every page carefully before signing while Camilla held the baby. They didn't ask questions about why we needed this or make it feel like we owed them anything, just signed where Tyler marked and handed the papers back. We scheduled the move for the following week, which gave us 6 days to pack up everything we owned while taking care of a 2-month-old who seemed to know something was happening and got fussy. John started boxing up the living room while I tackled the bedroom, both of us working in shifts around feeding schedules and diaper changes. Packing with a baby was harder than I expected because every time I got into a rhythm, she'd need something or start crying. I'd pack 3 boxes, then spend 20 minutes getting her settled, then pack 2 more before she needed to eat again. John took over when he got home from his shift, letting me sleep for a few hours before we switched, and I packed while he crashed on the couch. By the end of the week, we had most of our stuff in boxes stacked against the walls, the apartment looking bare and strange. Moving day hit me like a truck, because the baby decided to have her worst colic episode yet. She screamed from 6 in the morning straight through until noon, that horrible high-pitched wail that made my head pound and my hands shake. I was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep, trying to carry boxes down the stairs while she cried in the carrier strapped to my chest. John was hauling the heavier stuff and we were both sweating and exhausted when a neighbor from down the hall, some guy I'd maybe nodded at twice in the elevator, just walked over and grabbed a box. He didn't ask if we needed help or make a big deal about it. Just started carrying our stuff up 3 flights to the new apartment without saying much beyond asking which boxes went where. His help cut our moving time in half, and by 2 in the afternoon we had everything upstairs in a pile in the middle of the new living room. The apartment was definitely smaller. The walls this dingy beige color that looked like nobody had painted in years, and the carpet had stains near the door that made me not want to look too close. But when I stood in the empty bedroom holding my still crying daughter, and looked at the lease paperwork on the counter with only my name and John's name and no mention of Joffrey anywhere, the cramped space felt like freedom. We spent the rest of the day unpacking essentials, setting up the crib in the smaller bedroom and making the place livable enough to get through the night. By the time we got the baby fed and settled around 11, John crashed on his mattress on the living room floor because we hadn't set up his bed frame yet, and I collapsed on mine in the bedroom. The baby finally went quiet around midnight, and I lay there in the dark, listening to John's breathing from the other room and the unfamiliar sounds of our new place. That's when I let myself think about what I'd been avoiding for weeks. I had feelings for John, real ones that went past gratitude or friendship or just being glad he wasn't Joffrey. I wanted to be with him, wanted to see if what we'd built while taking care of my daughter could turn into something more. But I also knew we weren't ready, and rushing into anything romantic would mess up the stability we'd worked so hard to create. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app, typing out a reminder to myself that we'd agreed to wait, that taking care of my daughter had to come first, before any romantic stuff made things complicated. I saved the note and put my phone away, feeling both relieved and sad about the decision. My phone buzzed around 10 the next morning with a text from Joffrey asking if he could have another chance at a supervised visit. He said he'd started going to AA meetings and attached a photo of some kind of attendance card with signatures on it. I stared at the message for a long time, wanting to believe he was actually trying but remembering every other time he'd made promises and broken them. I forwarded the text to Amelia asking what she thought, and she called back within an hour. She said recovery attempts could be real, and the court would want to see him making efforts to improve, even if his past behavior was terrible. She suggested I agree to another visit in 2 weeks if he kept going to meetings and stayed sober, giving him time to prove the AA thing wasn't just for show. I texted Joffrey back saying he could visit at his parents' house 2 weeks from now if he brought proof of meeting attendance and showed up sober, making it clear that any alcohol smell or weird behavior would end the visit immediately. He responded with just, "Okay, thank you," which was more polite than I expected. The 2 weeks passed with me checking in with Camilla to make sure Joffrey was actually attending meetings and not just faking the attendance cards. She confirmed he was going, said he seemed uncomfortable and didn't talk much, but he showed up to the meetings her friend ran at the community center. When the visit day came, I drove to their house with the baby, my stomach tight with worry about how it would go. Joffrey was already there when I arrived, sitting on the couch looking nervous and sober. He stood up when I walked in and asked if he could hold her, his voice quieter than usual. I handed her over carefully, watching his hands to make sure he supported her head right, and he sat back down holding her like she might break. He asked questions about her routine, what time she usually ate and slept, whether she liked the pacifier or hated it, basic stuff that showed he didn't know anything about taking care of her but was trying to learn. The visit lasted the full 2 hours, and he stayed appropriate the whole time, didn't get weird or pushy, just held her and asked questions and looked uncomfortable but present. When I left with the baby, Camilla walked me to my car and said he'd seemed like he was genuinely trying, which didn't erase everything he'd done before, but was better than nothing. I drove home feeling confused about whether to hope he'd keep improving or expect him to mess up again. The 3-month pediatric appointment came a week later, and I brought all my notes about feeding schedules and sleep patterns, worried Haley would find something wrong. She weighed the baby and measured her length and checked all the developmental stuff, then looked up at me and said the weight gain was good, and everything looked great. She said I was clearly paying attention to the feeding schedule and doing everything right, that the baby was healthy and growing well despite all the stress. Walking out of that appointment with her positive report in my hand felt like proof I was doing something right even when everything else in my life was messy and complicated. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a minute, just breathing and feeling like maybe I could actually handle this. I started making plans for going back to the school the next semester, knowing I couldn't stay in survival mode forever. I emailed the campus childcare coordinator asking about infant care options and costs, then met with her in person 2 days later to see the facility and ask questions. She showed me the baby room with the cribs and changing tables and explained their ratios and schedules, gave me paperwork about income-based pricing that might make it affordable. I sat down with my academic advisor after that, and we mapped out which classes I could take online versus in person, calculating that I could handle 9 credits if I did 2 classes online and 1 on campus. Having a real timeline for getting back to my education made me feel like I wasn't permanently stuck, like this situation was temporary and I could still finish my degree. John came home one evening a few days later and mentioned casually that he'd sold his sneaker collection, the one he'd been building since high school with shoes he never wore but kept in boxes in his closet. I asked why, and he shrugged, saying he wasn't wearing them anyway, and the baby needed a better crib with a proper mattress instead of the hand-me-down one we'd been using. He'd already ordered the new crib online with the money, and it would arrive next week. The sacrifice was so quiet, no big announcement or asking for credit, just doing what needed to be done because the baby's safety mattered more than shoes he liked looking at. I thanked him, and he just nodded, going back to washing bottles like it was nothing. The court hearing for finalizing the temporary custody arrangement happened on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. I wore the one nice outfit I owned and showed up early with Amelia, sitting in the courthouse hallway watching other families wait for their cases. When our turn came, the judge reviewed all the paperwork, the paternity results and the visitation reports, and the child support calculations. She asked Joffrey about his employment status, and he admitted he was still looking but had applications out. She asked about the AA meetings, and he said he'd been going twice a week for 6 weeks now. The judge issued an order giving me primary physical custody, with Joffrey getting supervised visitation twice weekly at his parents' house. She ordered him to attend parenting classes and maintain employment for support payments, then increased the support amount by $40 a month based on state guidelines. She set a review date for 6 months out to see how everything was working. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was structured and enforceable. Real rules that couldn't just be ignored. Camilla and Dylan pulled me aside after the hearing and said they needed to talk about boundaries. They explained that they'd supervise Joffrey's visits but wouldn't cover for him or enable his avoidance anymore. They set up a regular babysitting schedule with me that happened regardless of whether Joffrey showed up for his visits, making it clear their relationship with their grandchild wasn't dependent on their son's behavior. They said being grandparents didn't mean protecting Joffrey from consequences, and they were done making excuses for him. The boundaries made their help feel real and sustainable instead of something that would disappear if Joffrey got mad or I didn't do what he wanted. I left the courthouse that day feeling like things were finally taking shape into something manageable. A few nights later, John and I sat at the kitchen table after the baby fell asleep, both of us nursing cheap coffee and avoiding eye contact. He cleared his throat and said he needed to talk about what was happening between us, the way we'd been looking at each other when we thought the other wasn't watching. I nodded, my stomach tight, and admitted I had feelings for him, but that rushing into anything would be stupid after everything with Joffrey. John agreed immediately, relief washing over his face, and suggested we wait at least 6 months before even thinking about dating, just to make sure we weren't confusing gratitude and convenience for something real. We shook hands across the table like we were signing a contract, both laughing nervously at how formal we were being about feelings, but the agreement felt right, even though part of me wanted to lean across and kiss him right then. 3 weeks later, I stood in the campus childcare center holding my daughter, trying not to cry as the coordinator gently took her from my arms and promised to text updates throughout the day. I walked to my first class in a fog, checking my phone every 5 minutes, barely hearing the professor's lecture about sociology concepts I used to find interesting. During the break, I texted John asking if she was okay, and he sent back a photo of himself folding laundry with a thumbs up, which made me smile despite my anxiety. By my second class, I managed to take actual notes, and by the time I picked her up that afternoon, I felt exhausted, but weirdly proud that I'd survived being both a student and a mom on the same day. The following Tuesday, John came home from his new father's group talking about a guy named Martin, who was learning to change diapers, and another dad who brought his kid to every meeting in a carrier. He seemed lighter, more confident, asking me questions about feeding schedules and sleep training like he genuinely wanted to understand the details, instead of just helping when I asked. Watching him take notes on his phone about baby development milestones made something warm spread through my chest. This man who wasn't even biologically related treating fatherhood like a skill worth mastering. 2 weeks after that, I took the baby to the park for Joffrey's supervised visit, and actually relaxed when he showed up 5 minutes early looking clean and sober. He played with her on the grass, making silly faces that got her to smile, and when the 2 hours ended, he handed her back without complaint or drama. That evening, he texted me a photo from the visit with a message saying he wanted to be consistent and prove he could show up, and I stared at my phone feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe the structure and accountability were finally getting through to him. On a quiet Tuesday evening, a month into the new routine, I sat at our kitchen table updating the budget spreadsheet while John washed bottles at the sink and our daughter slept peacefully in her crib. My phone buzzed with a notification that the first child support payment had processed and deposited, $240 that wasn't a fortune, but was something real. I looked around our cramped apartment with its mismatched furniture and peeling paint, thinking about how different this was from the life I'd imagined when I married Joffrey in that courthouse, how I'd pictured stability and partnership and got loneliness instead. But sitting here with John humming while he cleaned and my baby healthy in the next room, with my class schedule taped to the fridge and a routine that actually worked, I felt something close to okay. We were tired and broke and figuring things out one day at a time. But my daughter was thriving, I was back in the school, and we'd built something that felt honest and sustainable. That's the end of the story. Thank you for spending a few minutes here with me. I hope it left you feeling calm or maybe even hopeful about something in your own life. Subscribe if you would like to keep sharing quiet moments like this.